Welcome to part 2 of our discussion of key factor method operators defined in RxJava's Observable class. These operators create observable streams in various ways. We'll be focusing here on the create, interval, and rangeLong operators. Let's start a discussion with the create operator. This operator creates an observable that can emit multiple elements synchronously or asynchronously. The parameter that's passed to it, called observable on subscribe, has a subscribe method that receives an instance of a so-called observable emitter instance. Observable emitter, in turn, can emit events via its onNext, onError, and onComplete methods. The create operator, that's defined in RxJava's Observable class, supports more dynamic use cases than the earlier observable just and from iterable operators we talked about in part 1. In particular, you can have an open-ended number of events that are emitted. It returns an observable that will emit all the elements that are generated by the observable emitter that's passed. The elements that are going to be generated can be emitted from one or more threads, which is one of the other characteristics that gives this particular operator a lot more power than just and from iterable that were defined earlier. There's an example we'll take a look at in the case study at the end of this lesson that we show a snippet of on this page, where we use the create operator and we pass it a method reference called observable ex emit interval. And this emitter will use a background thread that's part of the implementation of observable interval and that operator, which we'll also talk about here shortly. Project Reactor has a create operator in its Flux class that works in a similar way, though believe it or not, it's actually more complex. The create operator that's part of RxJava is also very similar to the generate method that's defined in Java streams. Here's an example where we use generate to generate a stream of random, large, and unreduced big fractions. Let's now turn our attention to the interval operator. This operator creates an observable that emits long values starting with the value 0. The value is incremented at a specified time interval using a global timer with this particular version of interval. It returns a new observable that will emit increasing numbers at the regular intervals that are specified by the period and the time unit. This emits values on the scheduler's computation scheduler. That's what it uses by default. There are other overloaded interval methods that can designate another scheduler if you want to have one besides the one that's provided by computation. Under normal conditions, the observable that's emitting these events at regular intervals never completes. So this particular example here, which again we'll take a look at when we get to the case study at the end of this lesson, will generate a stream of longs every half a second in a background thread forever. And that's why we typically combine interval with a suppressing operator like take in order to bound the amount of things it actually emits. So this will only emit max iteration number of emitted values before it stops. And we'll talk about take when we get to suppressing operators. Project Reactor has a Flux interval operator that works essentially the same way as the one that's defined in RxJava. Once again, you can see here how we use interval in conjunction with take and Flux to take only a certain number of iterations of emitted values from interval. Let's now take a look at the rangeLong operator. This operator will be used to build an observable that only emits a sequence of incrementing longs from a start to a count. And the values that are emitted start at start and go up to count, and then the operator completes. Start is included in the range, up to and including count. This returns essentially what's known as a ranged observable that contains count elements in it. You can basically think about this operator, the rangeLong operator, as the moral equivalent of a reactive for loop. So here's an example where we're going to emit essentially 10 items from 1 to 10, starting at 1. And that's a good example. We'll take a look at that when we get into the case study at the end of this lesson. Project Reactor has a Flux range operator that behaves very much the same way. Again, this one will iterate from 1 to max iterations, emitting the integers. There is, interestingly, however, no rangeLong operator, which is kind of strange. So what you can do with Flux is you can use map in order to convert an integer to an unsigned long, just something that's a little piece of trivia that's useful to know. Both of these operators are very similar to the intStream ranged closed method that's defined in Java streams, where once again, in this case, we're generating a range of integer values from 1 to S max iterations, whatever that's defined to be. So that's the end of part 2 of our discussion of key factor method operators that are defined in RxJava's Observable class.